Okay, so you want to own a pub. The worn oak bar, the hand-pulled ales, the regulars who've been sitting in the same corner seat since 1987, the dartboard, the smell of Sunday roast drifting through the lounge, your name above the door, your beer garden filling up on a warm Friday evening. That's the picture. That's what every British television drama sells you. That's what the estate agent brochure is designed to make you feel when you walk through the door of a tired but charming village local. And imagine what it could be with the right person behind the bar. Here's what the brochure doesn't show you. The cellar flood that ruined 3 barrels of real ale the week before Christmas. The barrel line that needed replacing at $4,000 on a Tuesday morning when the pub was already fully booked for a Thursday quiz night. The brewery loan buried in the lease agreement that locks you into buying their beer at prices nobody negotiated in your favor. The fact that you haven't paid yourself a salary in 4 months because every pound you pulled from the till went straight back into the building before you could touch it. Owning a pub is one of the most romanticized and most misunderstood business models in Britain. On the outside, it looks like community, warmth, and a perfectly poured pint. On the inside, it looks like a business where your revenue depends on the weather, the football fixture list, a licensing authority that answers to nobody you know, and a customer base that has more entertainment options today than at any point in the past 100 years. Some pubs genuinely make money. Some pubs quietly drain their owners while maintaining the illusion of a full house on a Saturday night. And some pubs have destroyed people who walked in with their life savings, a genuine passion for hospitality, and no clear understanding of what they were actually buying. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly which kind you're likely to be standing in, and why. What a pub actually is, before we talk about money, we need to talk about what a British pub actually is. Because pub is one of those words that gets used to describe about a dozen completely different businesses that happen to have a bar in them. A tied house is a pub that operates under an agreement with a specific brewery or pub company, known as a pubco. The operator, called a tenant or lessee, does not own the building. They run it under a lease and are legally required to buy most or all of their beer, and sometimes their spirits and soft drinks exclusively from the company that owns the building. The pubco provides the premises. The tenant provides the labor, the vision, and most of the financial risk. A free house is a pub that operates without those purchasing restrictions. The landlord, often the actual owner of the building, can buy beer, wine, and spirits from any supplier they choose. Free houses have more purchasing flexibility, higher margin potential, and in most cases, significantly higher acquisition costs. A managed house is run by an employee of the pub company rather than an independent operator. The manager draws a salary. The pubco takes all the profit and assumes all the commercial risk. This is not what most people mean when they say they want to own a pub. A gastropub is a pub that has shifted its primary revenue center from wet sales, meaning drinks, to food. These operations have kitchen brigades, seasonal menus, and in some cases, Michelin recognition. The economics look more like a restaurant than a traditional pub, with higher revenue potential and significantly higher complexity. A community pub is often a smaller, independent local that survives on its role as a social institution. These are the village pubs, the estate locals, the end of terrace regulars. Their economics are tightly connected to population, walkability, and the spending habits of a fixed, sometimes aging, catchment area. A sports bar, a hotel bar, a music venue with a bar attached, a holiday park pub, a destination country pub with rooms. These are all called pubs. But they are not the same business. They share a license and a bar counter. Almost nothing else is identical. This script is going to focus primarily on the traditional tied or leasehold pub, the most common entry point for new operators, the one most people picture, and the one with the most complicated legal and financial structure, while explaining where the other models sit in the landscape. The price of the door. The largest upfront cost of entering the pub trade is not the bar stock. It is not the cellar equipment. It is the cost of acquiring the right to operate the business itself. And depending on what you're buying is more complicated than it first appears. In the British pub trade, there are broadly three ways to acquire a pub. You can buy the freehold, meaning you own the building and the land outright. You can acquire a long lease, typically 10 to 25 years, with an upfront premium and ongoing rent. Or you can take on a shorter tenancy agreement, often with lower upfront costs, but significantly less security and far more purchasing restrictions. Freehold pub prices vary so dramatically across regions that a national average is almost meaningless. According to Christie & Co., the specialist leisure property agent, the average freehold pub transaction in England and Wales in 2024 came in at approximately $325,000. But that average conceals a spread that runs from $80,000 for a struggling rural local in a depopulating market town to well over $2 million for a prominent free house in a desirable London neighborhood or a high-performing country gastropub with rooms. A wet-lid community pub in Stoke-on-Trent is not the same asset as a gastro destination in the Cotswolds with a 12-bedroom boutique hotel attached. Both are called pubs. One costs $150,000 and the other costs $1.8 million. The tied lease is a different calculation. Here, you are not buying the building. You are buying a business-in-a-box arrangement from a pub company. The premium for a leasehold tied pub can range from essentially nothing. Sometimes pub companies offer what are called nil premium agreements to attract operators to struggling sites, up to $250,000 or more for a profitable, well-located leasehold in a strong trading area. But that lower or zero upfront cost comes with a catch that new entrants consistently underestimate. Under a tied lease, you are obligated to purchase your beer, cider, and often wines and spirits from the pub company's nominated suppliers at prices set by the pub company. Those prices are typically 30 to 50% higher than the open market wholesale rate. The difference between what you pay under the tie and what you would pay as a free house operator is called the tie premium. It is the invisible rent on top of your visible rent. And over the life of a lease, it can cost an operator hundreds of thousands of pounds in reduced margin. The Pubs Code, introduced in England and Wales under the Small Business, Enterprise and Employment Act 2015, gives tied tenants of large pub companies, defined as those owning 500 or more tied pubs, the right to request a market rent-only option at certain trigger points in the lease. Under an MRO arrangement, the tenant pays a higher market rent but is freed from the purchasing tie and can buy their drinks on the open market. The principle sounds straightforward. The reality of navigating MRO negotiations with a large pub company has proven to be significantly more complicated in practice, involving independent assessors, legal representation, and timelines that can stretch to 18 months. The lease you didn't fully read. The lease agreement sitting beneath every tied pub in Britain is one of the most consequential documents in British small business, and it is one of the least understood by the people who sign it. A standard tied lease from a major pub company runs to 60 or 80 pages. It covers rent review mechanisms, repairing obligations, alienation rights, which govern whether you can sell the lease to someone else, subletting restrictions, insurance requirements, yield-up conditions, which govern the state in which you must return the premises at lease end, and the precise scope of the purchasing tie, including which products are tied, which are free of tie, and what penalties apply for purchasing outside the tie. The repairing obligation alone is something that catches new operators entirely unprepared. In a full repairing and insuring lease, which is the most common structure in the commercial pub trade, the tenant is responsible for the cost of maintaining the entire building, including the structure, the roof, the cellar, the fixtures and fittings, and the mechanical and electrical systems. In plain English, if the roof needs replacing while you're the tenant, you pay for the new roof on a building you do not own. A full structural survey of a pub building prior to signing a lease is not optional. It is essential. And yet, a significant proportion of new tenants either skip it to save money or commission only a basic valuation rather than a proper building survey. The cost of that decision can materialize years later as a dilapidations claim from the pub company at lease end, demanding tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds to restore the property to the condition defined in the lease. According to the British Beer and Pub Association, there are approximately 44,000 pubs in the United Kingdom as of 2025. That number was closer to 68,000 in the late 1980s. The closure rate over that period reflects not just changing consumer habits and competition from supermarket alcohol, but also a structural problem with the tied lease model that has driven thousands of operators out of business. The Campaign for Real CAMRA has documented extensively the impact of the pubco model on individual operators. Their research has consistently found that tied tenants in the major pub companies report lower profitability, higher levels of financial distress, and more frequent business failure than free-of-tie operators or freehold owners on equivalent sites. The capital you need before you open. You have found your pub. You have read the lease, commissioned a survey, taken legal advice, and agreed terms. Now the costs begin. The ingoing capital required to take on a tied lease, beyond any premium paid for the business, includes several categories that new entrants consistently budget too low. First, the deposit and advance rent. Most pub company leases require a deposit equivalent to 3 to 6 months of rent, held against the tenant's performance obligations. On a pub with an annual rent of $60,000, that deposit alone is $15,000 to $30,000, money that sits with the pub company and earns you nothing for the duration of the lease. Second, fixtures, fittings, and equipment. When you take on a tied lease, the pub company owns the building and often the cellar equipment, the cooling systems, the beer lines, and sometimes the furniture. What you buy is the goodwill and the tenant's trade fixtures, but you will also need to invest in equipment not covered by the company's provision. Commercial kitchen equipment for a food offer, replacement furniture and soft furnishings, point-of-sale systems, audio-visual equipment for sports screenings, Wi-Fi infrastructure, CCTV systems, and payment technology. A modest refurbishment on taking over a pub that is in reasonable but dated condition might run $20,000 to $50,000. A fuller refit on a pub that needs significant updating can easily reach $100,000 to $250,000. And here's the part that matters. Any capital improvement you make to the buildings you do not own is an improvement to an asset that will be handed back to the pub company at lease end. Your investment in the building accrues to the landlord, not to you. Third, working capital. A pub is a cash-intensive business with weekly wage bills, monthly rent, weekly supplier deliveries, and daily operational costs that do not pause while you build the trade. New operators are consistently advised to hold a minimum of 3 months of operating costs in reserve or before opening. On a pub with $25,000 per month in running costs, That means $75,000 sitting in a bank account that you cannot spend on the business, available purely as a buffer against the reality that most pubs trade below their long-term average in the first 6 to 12 months of new ownership. Fourth, licensing and compliance. A personal license, required by anyone serving or authorizing the sale of alcohol, costs $37 in application fees, plus the cost of an accredited licensing qualification, typically $150 to $400 depending on the provider. A premises license transfer can cost $500 or more depending on the rateable value of the premises, plus legal fees. DPS registration, allergen compliance documentation, food hygiene certification, health and safety risk assessments, fire safety compliance. These are not optional extras. They are legal prerequisites, and in a busy licensing authority area, delays in compliance can push back your opening date and run up costs you hadn't planned for. Total ingoing capital for a tied leasehold pub in decent condition, including deposit, working capital reserve, minor refurbishment, equipment, and compliance costs, realistically sits between $80,000 and $200,000 before you have served a single pint. For a freehold purchase, add the property acquisition cost, stamp duty land tax, which on a commercial property above $250,000 runs at 5% of the balance above that threshold, mortgage arrangement fees, legal fees typically $3,000 to $8,000 for a commercial purchase, and any structural or cosmetic works required before trading. A $350,000 freehold purchase with modest refurbishment work and standard acquisition costs requires upward of $420,000 in total capital to reach opening day. The revenue model and the margin problem. A pub's revenue comes from two primary sources: wet sales, meaning drinks, and dry sales, meaning food. Some pubs also generate revenue from accommodation, gaming machines, pool tables, private hire of function rooms, and live entertainment ticket sales. The single most important financial concept in pub economics is gross profit margin, specifically the wet margin. This is the percentage of your drinks revenue that remains after paying for the drinks themselves. A free house buying on the open market might pay a wholesale price of approximately $70 to $90 per 9-gallon firkin of cask ale. Selling that firkin across 72 pints at a retail price of $4.50 per pint generates $324 in revenue against an $80 cost, producing a gross margin of approximately 75%. Under a tied lease, the same firkin might cost $130 to $160 from the pub company's nominated supplier. The same 72 pints at $4.50 generates the same $324 in revenue. But now against $145 of cost, the gross margin falls to approximately 55%. That 20-point margin difference on every firkin you sell is the financial reality of the purchasing tie. It does not disappear. It compounds across every barrel, every keg of lager, every bottle of wine, every spirit you pour throughout the entire lease term. A pub selling 209-gallon cask ale firkins per year alongside substantial lager and spirits volume might be losing $15,000 to $30,000 annually in margin compared to what it would achieve free of tie, simply through the purchasing premium. According to the British Beer and Pub Association Statistical Handbook, the average British pub generates annual revenues of approximately $400,000. But that average is pulled upward by high-volume urban venues and destination food pubs. The median wet-led community pub in a secondary market is more likely generating $150,000 to $250,000 in annual turnover. Pub costs benchmark a well-run tied leasehold at a wet gross margin of 55 to 60%. Free houses typically target 65 to 72% on drinks. Food margins in a pub context run lower, typically 60 to 68% before labor. A gastropub doing significant food volume alongside drinks might blend its overall gross profit margin to somewhere around 62 to 68% overall. The costs that arrive every single day. Here is the structural reality of pub economics that separates people who understand this business from people who are surprised by it. Revenue is lumpy. It arrives in peaks on Friday and Saturday, picks up on bank holidays, football nights, and school holidays. It disappears on wet January Tuesdays in a way that is genuinely shocking if you've never lived through one. Costs are not lumpy at all. They arrive every single week, every month, every quarter, regardless of whether last Saturday's takings covered them. Rent is usually the first major fixed cost, and in the tied lease model, it is both visible and invisible. The visible rent on a typical leasehold community pub in England might run $25,000 to $60,000 per year. In London, leasehold pub rents regularly exceed $80,000 to $120,000 annually. Rent reviews, typically every 5 years, can increase this figure based on open market comparable rents, not on the actual profitability of the individual business. Wages are the largest single cost category for most pubs. The licensed trade is intensely labor dependent. A small pub needs at minimum 3 to 4 members of bar staff to cover opening hours across a week, plus kitchen staff if food is served, plus a manager if the owner cannot be present at all times. According to the Office for National Statistics, the hospitality sector in the United Kingdom has the highest labor turnover rate of any industry, regularly exceeding 70% annually. That means hiring, training, and losing staff is not a one-time cost. It is a permanent overhead. Following increases to the national living wage, which rose to $12 to $21 per hour for workers aged 21 and over in April 2025. Wage costs have increased substantially. A small pub employing the equivalent of 3 full-time members of staff is spending approximately $75,000 to $90,000 per year on wages before employer national insurance contributions, which add a further 13.8% on earnings above the secondary threshold. The April 2025 budget changes to employer national insurance, which reduced the secondary threshold from $9,100 to $5,000 per employee and raised the rate from 13.8% to 15%, added an estimated $3,500 to $5,000 per year in additional employment costs to a typical small pub. The British Beer and Pub Association estimated that the combined impact of the national living wage increase and the national insurance changes would cost the pub sector an additional $500 million, 2025 alone. Utilities are the third major recurring cost. A pub runs commercial refrigeration, cellar cooling, dishwashers, glass washers, kitchen extraction, heating systems, and lighting across extended opening hours 7 days a week. Annual electricity and gas costs for a medium-sized pub typically run $18,000 to $35,000. During the energy price crisis of 2021 to 2023, many pubs saw these bills double or triple with no mechanism to pass the full increase onto customers without damaging trade. Cellar costs and line cleaning are ongoing costs specific to the beer dispense system. Beer lines must be cleaned weekly to maintain product quality and comply with health standards. Either a cellar technician visits weekly at approximately $20 to $40 per visit, or the landlord does it themselves, which takes roughly 2 hours. Cellar gas for dispensing lager and operating the cooling system runs $200 to $400 per month, depending on volume. Equipment maintenance and replacement for cooling systems, gas regulators, and dispense equipment add several £1,000s per year. Business rates are a significant fixed overhead. Pubs in England pay non-domestic rates based on the rateable value of the premises, set by the Valuation Office Agency. Following the 2023 revaluation, many pub rateable values increased substantially. A community pub with a rateable value of $30,000 pays approximately $15,000 in business rates per year before any applicable reliefs. The government's extended retail hospitality and leisure relief, which provided 75% relief on rates up to a cap for hospitality businesses, was reduced in April 2024 and was wound down further in 2025, increasing costs for many operators who had come to rely on it. Insurance for a pub requires a specialist hospitality policy covering the building on a freehold, public liability for customers who slip, fall, or are injured, employer liability, product liability, business interruption, licensee liability, and often seller stock coverage. A comprehensive pub insurance policy runs $3,000 to $8,000 per year depending on turnover, location, and claims history. Accountancy, legal, and compliance costs round out the fixed overhead picture. A pub owner needs a qualified accountant familiar with the license trade, regular legal advice on lease matters, a personal license holder designated premises supervisor on the license, and ongoing compliance with allergen labeling requirements, which became significantly more demanding following Natasha's Law. These costs, individually modest, collectively add $3,000 to $7,000 per year. The dirty number. What profit actually looks like. Let's build a realistic profit and loss account for a fictional but representative tied leasehold pub in a market town in the English Midlands. Annual turnover of $280,000, roughly $200,000 in wet sales and $80,000 in food. These are not exceptional numbers. They are typical for a well-run community pub with a modest food offer. Gross profit on wet sales at a tied margin of 57% is $114,000. Gross profit on food at 62% is $49,600. Total gross profit is $600. Overall gross margin of approximately 58%. Now the costs. Rent at $42,000 per year. Wages and employer's national insurance for 3 full-time equivalent staff, $90,000. Utilities, $24,000. Seller costs and line cleaning, $6,000. Business rates after any applicable relief, $8,000. Insurance, $4,500. Accountancy and professional fees, $4,000. Marketing, repairs and maintenance, sundry costs, $9,000. Total overhead, $187,500. Net profit before debt service and owner remuneration, minus $23,900. That is a loss. On a pub turning over $280,000. Running at a competent operational standard with reasonable cost control. The underlying economics of the tied lease model produce a net loss before the owner has taken a single pound of salary. This is not a worst-case scenario. This is the mathematical reality of a model, where the purchasing tie removes 15 to 20 margin points from the gross profit line, where the national living wage has increased every April for 6 consecutive years, and where energy costs remain elevated compared to the pre-2021 baseline. There are paths to profitability. Turnover above $350,000 begins to generate genuine leverage on the fixed cost base. A stronger food offer at higher covers and higher average spend per head improves the blended margin. Events programming, quiz nights, live music, themed evenings can drive midweek volume that the fixed overhead desperately needs. A well-negotiated MRO arrangement or a freehold acquisition removes the tied premium from the equation entirely. But those are not the conditions most new operators walk into on day one. What the market has done to the British pub. To understand why pub economics look the way they do in 2025, you have to understand what has happened to the British pub over the past 3 decades. In 1989, the Monopolies and Mergers Commission produced a report known as the Beer Orders. It concluded that the 6 major national breweries, which at that point owned approximately 75% of all tied pubs in Britain, exercised a monopoly that restricted competition and consumer choice. The government's remedy was to force the major brewers to sell off large portions of their pub estates. What happened next was not what the policymakers intended. The breweries sold their pubs, but they didn't sell them to independent operators or to local communities. They sold them in bulk to newly formed property companies, the pubcos, whose business model was not brewing beer or running hospitality businesses. Their business model was owning buildings, managing rent income, and maximizing the value of the purchasing tie. Enterprise inns, punch taverns, Mitchells and Butlers, and others assembled enormous pub estates, financed with substantial levels of debt, and structured their income to flow from 2 sources: rent and the tied purchasing margin. They had limited incentive to invest in the fabric of the buildings because the repairing obligation had been passed to the tenants. They had every incentive to set purchase prices for tied products at the highest level tenants could sustain without triggering mass closures, because the margin on tied sales was the engine of their financial model. The model worked while consumer spending on pub going was strong. Then 3 things happened in relatively quick succession. Supermarket alcohol became dramatically cheaper. Between 1980 and 2010, the real price of alcohol in off-licenses and supermarkets fell by approximately 75% relative to wages. The price of alcohol in pubs rose over the same period. The price gap between drinking at home and drinking in a pub widened from something small and manageable to something that fundamentally changed consumer behavior. The smoking ban of July 2007 removed one of the primary reasons many regular pub goers went to the pub. The social smoker who stood at the bar for 3 pints on a Tuesday evening became the social smoker who stood outside their own back door for 3 cans bought at the supermarket. The immediate post-ban period saw a permanent reduction in casual pub visiting that never fully recovered. Then the 2008 financial crisis struck. Pub companies carrying heavy debt loads from their acquisition phases found themselves holding property assets whose values were falling as pub closures mounted. Punch Taverns alone was carrying over $3 billion of debt. Enterprise Inns had debts exceeding $2 billion. The debt structures collapsed into complex refinancing arrangements that put sustained pressure on tenant rents because those rents were the primary income stream servicing the debt. According to Camera's closure data, between 2000 and 2025, Britain lost approximately 24,000 pubs. In the years 2020 to 2022, the closures accelerated dramatically as COVID lockdowns removed virtually all pub revenue for extended periods while costs continued. The pubs that closed were not simply badly run. Many of them were structurally unviable under the cost model imposed upon them by the lease structures they operated within. The COVID effect and the recovery that wasn't quite, March 2020. Every pub in Britain closed on the same day. Not struggling pubs, not tied pubs or managed pubs or community pubs. Every pub. For the first time since the Second World War, the British pub went dark. The financial impact was immediate and total. Revenue went to zero. Fixed costs did not. Rents continued to accrue. Insurance payments continued. Business rates were suspended under emergency measures, but most other costs simply accumulated. The furlough scheme supported wage costs, but it did not support the self-employed landlords and licensees who sat above the payroll. Government support came in waves. The Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, the Bounce Back Loan Scheme, the Eat Out to Help Out program in summer 2020, the Extended Business Rates Holiday. These measures collectively prevented a catastrophic collapse of the sector during lockdown periods. But they were repayable loans, stacking onto businesses whose balance sheets were already stretched, and non-repayable grants that varied dramatically in generosity depending on a pub's rateable value. When pubs reopened, first with outdoor service only, then with restrictions on indoor capacity, then with table service requirements, the trading picture was inconsistent and costly. Social distancing reduced capacity in buildings whose financial models were built on normal capacity. Increased cleaning requirements added labor hours. Menu simplification to reduce kitchen complexity hit food revenue. And staff who had left the hospitality sector during the pandemic had in many cases moved into other industries and did not return. According to UK Hospitality, the sector's trade body, the licensed trade ended 2024 with approximately 5,000 fewer pubs than it had at the end of 2019. The recovery, such as it was, happened unevenly. Destination pubs, gastropubs, and venues with strong outdoor space recovered more quickly. Wet-led community pubs in secondary locations, the ones most dependent on regular habitual trade rather than destination visits, recovered more slowly or did not recover. The debt accumulated during the pandemic period, specifically the bounce-back loans and CBILs facilities, began to mature in 2023 and 2024. Pubs that had borrowed to survive lockdown now faced repayment schedules on top of operating cost inflation running at its highest level since the 1980s. What the people who thrive actually do differently. If the economics of the traditional tied leasehold pub are as marginal as the numbers suggest, why do some operators build genuinely profitable and growing pub businesses? The honest answer is that the operators who thrive have almost universally found a way to generate revenue from sources that do not run through the pub company's pricing structure. Food is the most obvious and most powerful lever. A wet-led pub selling $200,000 of drinks per year is capped in its margin by the purchasing tie. A gastro pub selling $150,000 of drinks and $250,000 of food is operating with a much more favorable blended gross margin, a much stronger average revenue per head, and a much better claim on the spending of customers who might otherwise have gone to a restaurant rather than a pub. The transition from wet-led to food-led is not simple. It requires kitchen investment, a competent chef, supply chain relationships that are entirely separate from the pub company's purchasing structure, and a front-of-house team with service standards closer to a restaurant than a traditional bar. But it is the single most reliable route from marginal viability to genuine profitability in the British pub trade. Rooms and accommodation are the second major lever. A country pub with 4, 6, or 8 letting bedrooms is running a hybrid business. The accommodation revenue sits entirely outside the pub company's tied purchasing structure. It arrives every night, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, and it contributes directly to the overhead absorption that makes the whole operation viable. A rural pub doing $150,000 in food and drinks revenue that adds 6 letting bedrooms at an average occupancy of 60%, and an average room rate of 120 tossers might generate an additional $157,000 per year in accommodation revenue at very high margin. That revenue can transform the profitability of an otherwise marginal business. Events and private hire are a third category that many operators underutilize. A pub with a function room that can accommodate 80 people for a wedding reception or a corporate dinner has an asset that the pub company charges no tied premium on. Private hire events at $200 to $8,000 per event, 20 events per year, generates $50,000 to $160,000 in revenue, where the operator retains the margin structure of their choosing. Community-owned pubs represent a growing and genuinely interesting model. When a village pub faces closure, communities across Britain have organized share offers, raised capital from local residents and supporters, and purchased pubs into community ownership. The Plunkett Foundation estimates that approximately 200 community-owned pubs were operating in the United Kingdom as of 2024, with more in various stages of formation. Community pubs are structurally different in that their primary obligation is to remain open and serve the community, rather than to maximize shareholder returns. They often attract grant funding and volunteer labor that would be unavailable to a commercially operated pub, and their financial resilience derives partly from the community's emotional investment in keeping them open. The most consistently profitable pub operators in Britain are not the ones trying to squeeze more gross margin from a tied lease. They are the ones who looked at what the pub's code actually gives them, pursued MRO arrangements at the appropriate trigger points, acquired freeholds when the opportunity arose, and built revenue from food, rooms, events, and experiences that the pub company cannot touch with their purchasing structure. The tax and property picture. There is a category of pub acquisition that makes financial sense for reasons that have very little to do with the actual pub business. It looks like the luxury ranch that wealthy Americans buy, not for the cattle, but for the tax position and the capital appreciation. In the British context, it looks like a freehold pub in a desirable location, acquired by an investor who understands the property cycle and the business rates relief structure. Freehold pub properties in England and Wales qualify for 100% business property relief from inheritance tax after 2 years of qualifying ownership, provided the owner is engaged in a qualifying trading activity. This means that a freehold pub passed from a deceased owner to their heirs is not subject to the 40% inheritance tax that would apply to most other property assets above the nil rate band. For families with significant wealth looking to transfer assets intergenerationally, a profitable freehold pub in a strong location can serve simultaneously as a trading business, a property asset appreciating in a limited supply market, and an inheritance tax planning vehicle. The Community Asset Listing process, introduced under the Localism Act 2011, gives local communities the right to nominate pubs as assets of community value. A listed pub can only be sold after a 6-month moratorium period, during which community groups have the right to prepare and submit a bid. This does not give communities a right to purchase, but it does delay a sale long enough for a community effort to organize. Approximately 1,400 pubs are listed as assets of community value in England as of 2025. Freehold pub valuations have behaved differently in different parts of the country over the past decade. In London and the South East, freehold pub prices have in many cases disconnected from the underlying trading value of the pub business, in the same way that hill country ranch land has disconnected from its agricultural value. A prime freehold pub in Notting Hill or Richmond is priced on its development potential, its residential conversion value, and the scarcity of such assets in a market with planning restrictions on change of use, as much as on what it earns selling beer. The permitted development rights that once allowed straightforward residential conversion of pub buildings were restricted from 2017, requiring planning permission for change of use of pubs listed as assets of community value. This has preserved some freehold pub stock from residential conversion, and in doing so has maintained a floor under freehold pub values, as in communities that have been active in pursuing listings. Building a real scenario. Let's build a realistic picture of what the first 3 years might look like for someone who acquires a leasehold-tied pub in a secondary market town in the East Midlands, with genuine ambition to build a profitable food and events business. Annual rent of $40,000, turnover in year 1 of $220,000. Turnover target by year 3 of $320,000 through a developing food and events offer. Ingoing capital, lease premium of $60,000, deposit of $20,000. Refurbishment and equipment of $45,000, working capital reserve of $50,000, licensing and compliance of $5,000. Total, $180,000. Year 1, gross revenue $220,000. Gross profit at 57% margin across the mix, $125,400. Rent, $40,000. Wages and NI for 3 full-time equivalents, including a part-time chef, $85,000. Utilities, $22,000. Seller costs and maintenance, $7,000. Business rates at $7,500. Insurance, $4,000. Professional fees and sundry costs, $8,000. Total costs, $173,500. Net profit minus $48,100. That is a loss. Year 1 of a pub turnaround, operating from a standing start with a trade to build, frequently operates at a loss. The working capital reserve exists precisely to absorb this. Year 2, turnover grows to $270,000 as the food offer establishes and the events calendar begins to generate private hire bookings. Fixed costs do not grow proportionally. Net profit, approximately $5,000 to $15,000, depending on energy costs and how quickly the food margin is optimized. Break-even or marginal profitability. Year 3, turnover reaches $320,000. The kitchen is established. The events program is running 18 bookings per year. A Sunday lunch trade has grown to be the strongest session of the week. Net profit, $30,000 to $50,000 before owner remuneration. The operator can begin to pay themselves a modest salary for the first time. This is not a spectacular return on $180,000 of invested capital and 3 years of very hard work. It is a business that has crossed from loss to profit and is beginning to create genuine value. By year 5, if the trade continues to develop, an operator who invested $180,000 might be able to sell the lease for $90,000 to $130,000, having drawn a salary for 2 or 3 years. The total return on investment is real but modest. The return in terms of lifestyle, autonomy, community role, and the intangible satisfaction of running the local is something that cannot be put in a spreadsheet and is consistently the reason people do this regardless. The 2 scenarios, honest maths, the good year. You run a freehold community pub in a market town in Yorkshire. You've been trading for 4 years. The food operation is well established. You have a function room that does 12 private hires per year, a strong quiz night on Thursdays, and a Sunday lunch service that is fully booked most weeks. Annual turnover of $420,000. Gross margin of 66% because you're free of tie and buying on the open market. Gross profit of $270,200. Total overheads, including a small mortgage on the freehold, wages for 6 staff, utilities, rates, and insurance of $230,000. Net profit of $47,200, from which you pay yourself a reasonable wage. You also own the building, which appreciated 6% in value this year and is now worth $380,000 against a purchase price of $310,000 4 years ago. Good year, the bad year. You've held a tied lease for 3 years. The rent review in year 2 increased your rent by 12%. Energy costs spiked. You lost your head chef in March and couldn't replace him until May, losing 10 weeks of your best food trade during the spring. The pub company's nominated wine supplier discontinued 2 of your best-selling lines, and the replacement products haven't gone down well. A local competitor opened with a stronger food offer in September and took a meaningful share of your Sunday lunch trade. Annual turnover fell to $195,000 from $240,000 the prior year. The Tide margin gave you 56% gross profit, $109,200. Your costs were $185,000. Net loss, $75,800. You spent the working capital reserve. You're considering whether to surrender the lease. The gap between those two scenarios is driven by lease structure, chef retention, competitor dynamics, and a rent review. Almost none of those things were entirely within your control. And unlike many businesses, you cannot pause operations during the bad period. The pub has to open or it generates nothing. The honest conclusion: the romance of the British pub is real. There is genuinely something irreplaceable about a well-run local. The role it plays in its community, the relationships it sustains, the sense of place it embodies are things that no other institution quite replicates in British life. The 44,000 pubs that remain open in 2025 persist partly because the people running them believe in something beyond the profit and loss account. But the economics of the British pub are unforgiving and have been made more unforgiving over the past 30 years by a combination of structural changes in the lease model, sustained cost inflation, changing consumer habits, and regulatory requirements that have added cost without adding revenue. The people who thrive in this business are not the ones who walked in on the strength of a dream and a love of a good pint. They are the ones who understood from day one that the purchasing tie was a structural tax on their gross margin and planned accordingly. The ones who built food and events revenue that the pub company cannot touch. The ones who pursued freehold ownership when the opportunity arose, because owning the building changes the entire financial equation. The ones who maintained enough working capital to survive the bad year without walking away. The people who struggle, and there are many, are the ones who underestimated the ingoing capital, overestimated the goodwill of the existing trade, misread the lease, or simply hit 2 bad years in a row without the reserves to absorb them. The pub can be a wonderful life. It can be a real business. It can, in some circumstances, be a genuinely valuable asset. But it will not reward people who approach it as though the hard part is finding the right pub. The hard part is understanding what you're buying before you sign anything, building a revenue model that works within the constraints of the agreement you've entered, and surviving long enough for the community to become yours as much as you've become theirs. The last round is called. The glasses are collected. The lights go on. And tomorrow morning, you do it all again.